there is a piece of land in the middle of the Venice lagoon that no ferry will stop at. Fishermen sail around it. For years, Italy tried to sell it, and nobody would keep it. They call it the most haunted island on Earth. They say 160,000 people died there. They say the soil is half human ash. They say a doctor drilled into the skulls of the insane until the tower he worked in threw him out a window. Almost none of that is true. And the real story, the one nobody tells you, is about how an entire island's worth of human suffering got turned into a ghost story, sold as fact, copied 1,000 times, and believed by millions of people who never once asked where the number came from. This is the Unresolved, and this is Poveglia's story. This is what actually happened. And this is how the lie got bigger than the truth. 17 acres. That's all Poveglia is. A scrap of land in the southern Venice lagoon, close enough that you can see it from the Lido, too small to appear on most tourist maps of the city. Today it's owned by the Italian state and, as of very recently, partly leased to a local citizens group trying to turn it into a public park. But for most of the last 60 years, it simply sat there. 15 collapsing buildings, a 12th century bell tower doubling as an old lighthouse, a rabbit colony that outnumbers any human visitor, and no electricity, no running water, no ferry line. You need special government permission to set foot on it. Most of what remains is structurally unsafe. Collapsed ceilings, rotted staircases, decades of vegetation reclaiming brick. It is, by every physical description, just an abandoned island. So why does it have a reputation as the most cursed piece of land in Europe? Because of what happened here across 400 years, and because of what people decided to say happened here, which turned out to be two very different stories. Poveglia's history starts nowhere near a plague. Roman records mention it as early as 421 AD, used first as a military outpost, then centuries later as a quiet farming and fishing settlement. In 1379, war caught up with it. The War of Chioggia leveled most of the island, and the population that survived eventually scattered into Venice itself. For nearly 400 years afterward, Poveglia was mostly empty. Its transformation into the Plague Island didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen during the outbreak most people assume. When people say Black Death, they usually mean the catastrophic 14th century pandemic that killed roughly a third of Europe. Poveglia had no quarantine infrastructure during that outbreak. What actually happened is more specific and more interesting. Venice, as one of the busiest trade ports on Earth, kept getting hit by recurring waves of bubonic plague for centuries after the Black Death itself. Major outbreaks in 1576 and 1630 killed tens of thousands in the city alone. Venice responded by building a system, isolated islands, called lazaretti, where the sick and the merely exposed were sent before the disease could spread through the city. Poveglia's formal role in that system solidified late, starting in 1776 and made permanent in 1793, after 2 ships were found carrying plague cases and the city's 2 main quarantine islands were already full. It stayed a quarantine site until 1814. So the real story isn't Poveglia during the Black Death. It's Poveglia as one link in Venice's 400-year war against recurring plague. That's a less catchy sentence, and it's also the actual history. Here's what we do know happened, and it's horrifying enough without embellishment. Anyone showing even mild symptoms of plague, a fever, a swelling, was pulled from their home, separated from family, and shipped to Poveglia by barge. Once there, they entered a 40-day waiting period. 40 days to find out if their body would fight off the infection or if it would kill them. Most didn't survive the wait. A 16th century Venetian chronicler named Rocco Benedetti left behind written accounts from this era, describing overcrowded sick beds and workers moving through the wards, constantly to clear the dead, a grim, mechanical daily routine repeated for months during the worst outbreaks. Bodies were burned to slow the spread of infection, a practical decision that, over decades, left behind an unknown quantity of human ash mixed into the island's earth. This is where the famous claim comes from, that 50% of Poveglia's soil is cremated human remains. It's a claim repeated in nearly every article and video about this island. But notice something. It's always phrased the same way. It is said, rumor has it, locals believe. Nobody ever attaches it to an actual soil study, because no verified scientific analysis of Poveglia's soil composition confirming that number exists. It's a striking image that has never been tested. That doesn't mean the underlying horror isn't real. People absolutely died on this island, in large numbers, over centuries of recurring plague. But there's a difference between people suffered and died here, which is true, and we know precisely how much of this ground is made of them, which nobody has ever actually verified. In 1922, more than a century after the quarantine station closed, Poveglia got a second dark chapter, a hospital for the mentally ill. By the standards of the era, and by many surviving accounts, conditions were bad. Patients with disabilities, neurological conditions, or symptoms that simply didn't fit the culture's narrow definition of normal were sent here, often permanently. Treatments described in historical accounts include electroconvulsive therapy and other procedures that would be considered unconscionable by modern medical ethics. And then there's the story most true crime and horror channels led with: a hospital director who performed illegal lobotomies on his patients using crude tools, without anesthesia, and who allegedly went mad himself, climbing the island's bell tower before falling or being thrown to his death, supposedly chased by the ghosts of everyone he'd tortured. It's a phenomenal horror story. It has a villain, a body count, and supernatural justice at the end. It's also, according to the historical record, something that traces back not to hospital archives or court records, but to television. Which brings us to the part of this video that most channels skip entirely. In 2009, an American ghost hunting TV show filmed an episode on Poveglia. That episode is the earliest traceable source for the claims that now define the island's entire reputation. The haunting, the scale of the death toll, and elements of the mad doctor story as it's told today. The Italian Committee for the Investigation of Claims on Pseudosciences, CICAP, Italy's leading skeptical research organization, looked into where these numbers actually came from. Their conclusion, the widely repeated figure of over 100,000 plague victims buried in mass pits, and the full haunted island narrative built around it, traces back to that television production, not to historical documentation. Venetian historian Alberto Tosofei went further in comments to the New York Times, explaining that Poveglia was just one of several islands used to isolate the sick during Venice's various plague outbreaks, and that the actual number of people who can be historically confirmed to have died from plague, specifically on Poveglia, is closer to 20. 20. Not 100,000, not 160,000. 20. Now, does that mean nothing bad happened here? No. The asylum era was real. The neglect was real. The quarantine system genuinely separated the dying from their families for centuries across the wider Venetian lagoon. The horror doesn't need the invented number to be true. But somewhere between a TV crew looking for ratings in 2009 and today, a small, sad island with a difficult history became the most haunted place on Earth. And every retelling since, including, statistically, most of what you'll find if you search this topic right now, has just copy-pasted the version with better numbers, without checking them once. That's the real story of Poveglia. not a cursed island. A case study in how quickly a myth outruns a fact when the myth is more shareable. The asylum closed in 1968. The island sat empty for decades, briefly farmed, then abandoned completely. In 2014, Italy tried to auction off a 99-year lease, hoping a developer would turn the ruins into a hotel. The highest bid came from a businessman who later became Venice's mayor, and the deal collapsed. A citizens group called Poveglia per tutti, Poveglia for everyone, had formed specifically to stop the island from becoming a private resort, raising money from thousands of small donors to compete in the auction themselves. After years of legal battles, that group won. As of August 2025, part of Poveglia has been granted to Poveglia per tutti under a long-term concession to build a public, locals-only park access for the people who live nearby, not developers, not ghost tourism operators. Which means the ending to this story is stranger than any curse. After 4 centuries of plague, exile, and manufactured hauntings, Poveglia's next chapter might just be a park. Rabbits, walking trails, and a bell tower with a much quieter future than its past. Poveglia didn't need a television crew to make it a tragic place. Centuries of real quarantine, real death, and real institutional neglect already did that. That's not just Poveglia's story. That's what happens to almost every most haunted place on Earth you've ever heard of. Don't just listen to the rumors. Subscribe to the only channel making dark history and true crime that actually checks its sources. Hit that button, and let's get into the real story.